Hi, welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Deborah.
Your book, I have it right here, Soul Deep Beauty, Finding Our True Worth in a World Demanding Flawless. This is Beauty is in the Eye of Our Beholder series, and we're discussing what it means to be seen beautiful in the eyes of God. And there's just so many reactions that I get when I read your book. I was like, okay, this is definitely a book that is going to help a lot of women navigate this. So, what I wanted to start with is for you to tell us about yourself and what led you to exploring beauty.
So, a little bit about myself. So, I'm a marriage and family therapist here in Minnesota. And I also am going to start teaching again next week, actually, at Bethel. So, it's Bethel University here in the St. Paul, Minnesota area. And I teach a course on essentially soul well being. And so, that both those things that make up my work, as well as hosting the Impossible Beauty podcast about redefining beauty. But yeah, a little bit about my story and how I got into writing Soul Deep Beauty, which was not my original plan. So it's been really interesting to see how this has developed. So I was working as a marriage and family therapist about 8 or 9 years ago now, when my own therapist let me know that my own thoughts and behaviors around food and movement were in line with a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And I think there was some denial there, but also I was really taken aback by her diagnosis and telling me that, largely because I think a lot of the beliefs and behaviors that I had adopted are so lauded in our culture. And so I ended up having to actually pause my work as a therapist and do my own intensive work around this eating disorder. And it ended up really shifting my trajectory of my work and where I spend my time, because about, I would say, I don't know, 6 months or later into my intensive treatment for an eating disorder, which I ended up doing actually full time, I started to see that so much of the beliefs that I was seeing in the therapy rooms were also the beliefs that our culture was praising and teaching us. These same beliefs were and struggles, I would say, were very prevalent in my own friend groups, in casual conversations. And so I started to see just how warped our ideas of beauty have become. And also I started to see how it was diminishing me and taking me away from who I think God was inviting me to be, who He created me to be, but also so many women and girls. And I think the conversation is larger than women or girls. Just talking about the impacts on the female is already huge. And so, and obviously I'm a female, I'm more common with those pressures. But I started to see that, like, I couldn't not speak out about how this is impacting our souls. This
Mhm.
is like disintegrating us at a very deep level. And I didn't think people were warning. No one had warned me. And I really wanted to raise the red flag on this and increase awareness so we can choose something different.
I think that's great because when I was in high school, I always kind of felt awkward about how I looked, a little shorter, curly hair. And I was never felt like I was thin, although now I look back on pictures and I'll go, wow, you look really good. Because I was like chased in the past, which you talked about too. And so I was reading 17 magazine, and the models talked about purging their food to keep thin. And one of my girlfriends and I, we thought, well, maybe we can look like them if we do what they do. And
Yes,
so I went through about a 4-year period of being bulimic. And thankfully, I wanted to sing, and I knew that would hurt my throat. And so it took me about a year to quit. But I realized after reading your book that I still have, though, a lot of body, I think you call it dissatisfaction, and then the problems with how I fit in. Am I good enough with my body? Especially as I'm getting older now, going into another, age time season. So when we talk about that, how do we, in a sense, fall back in love with our bodies?
yes.
You know,
Such a good question, Deborah. And first of all, thank you for sharing that about your own story. And that's huge. And also, I'm like taken aback by the fact that 17 magazine like shared that. And oh my gosh, like I'm already like, oh
or
my
no.
word. core.
Especially at that age, so impressionable when you're just discovering yourself as a woman.
But how do we fall back in love with our bodies? I think that's an amazing question. What I do think is helpful is, and this is what I try to do in the book too, is help us gain some media literacy and start to see,
Mm.
first of all, how so many of the images that we see are fake, like literally fake images and have
Yeah.
been retouched and changed. And so for us to have a new lens that we view media through to see, first of all, much of this is fake. In the book, I reference additional reading information. I reference one of Jean Kilbourne's talks, Killing Us Softly, where she shows some of the photo editing where literally parts of people's legs or torsos are taken out. And also, we just live in a really media saturated culture. One of the statistics I like to talk about is this documentary called The Illusionists, and the creator and producer of that, Elena Rossini, talks about how it was estimated during the year 2020, we'd be at the point of 80% of our waking hours, we'd be exposed to some kind of media. So we're media saturated. And so if so much of our head and our hearts are looking at these images that are fake, of course we're going to, it's just like this natural human tendency we have to then compare ourselves to it. So, of course, if it's a fake image that is, quote, flawless, we are going to perceive flaws within ourselves. And so I think having some media literacy and knowing, okay, when I look at this, even asking ourselves what has been likely retouched here, what body parts have been enhanced or changed. And I think on top of that, there's a whole nother layer when we think about advertising and especially in our very consumeristic culture. Oftentimes I've seen how shame, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to beauty and body image, shame is used as a tool to sell products. We are purposefully being made to feel bad about our bodies that in some way our body or our face or our whatever,
Mhm.
we don't reach the bar. We're not living up to being, quote, beautiful. And
Mhm.
so I think when we can start to become more aware of the forces that are at play, we can perhaps see those things differently so they don't have the emotional punch and maybe don't internalize them as much. Also, I think it can be really helpful to turn the volume down on viewing those images. And I think that's one piece. Another thing that Dr. Hilary McBride talks a lot about is this idea of embodiment. And there are a lot of other people who talk about it as well. But essentially, it's this idea of focusing on living in our bodies versus looking at our bodies. So much of like when I consider my own body, and maybe this is the case for listeners or readers as well, we have been taught to consider our bodies from a third person perspective. So like what my body looks like on my Instagram feed or in a picture. Whereas what Hillary McBride and others are encouraging us to do is actually living into the experience of being a body.
Mhm.
Like, what does it feel like when my body feels strong and I'm like, I don't know, like on a hike or I'm water skiing and I am like filled with joy in this moment for what my body can do and the function that it has. And like, since we've probably started this interview, Deborah, I don't know how many times my heart has beaten or how many breaths I've
Mhm.
taken, but like every time that happens, it is literally a miracle. And I have not done anything for my brain, or well, it's true for my brain, true as well, but for my heart or my breath to just keep going. So thinking more about our bodies in terms of what they can do and the miracle that they are versus how we've been taught to think about our bodies as a problem to solve or what is wrong with them versus if we were to make a list of what is right with our bodies, that list would be far outweigh the perceived flaws. And I want to be really specific. These are perceived flaws. Problems have been invented to make money. For instance, cellulite was, I can never remember the year, if it was 69 or 70, but Vogue used cellulite for the first time in the way that we now know it to make this a problem so that people can sell products to, quote, solve that problem. Our bodies are not the problem. I think how we have been made to think about our bodies so people can sell products is ultimately the problem.
That's what's so great about your book is that we have these questions about ourselves and our body. You lead us in the book of different ways through your journey, personal story. One of the things that really stood out was the shame of that the American beauty culture shares us, but then also you went very deep with that, which was really the crux, spiritual. That was important for me to understand that. So when any of those thoughts are coming to take them captive and question them.
Thank you for bringing that up because that's such an important part to me. What I talk about is how Dr. Kurt Thompson is a psychiatrist and an author, and he calls shame a minion of evil. And I think that that is just so spot on because I think that however you want to say it, the evil or the enemy uses shame to diminish us and distract us. Kurt Thompson would say it like become the artifacts of beauty that we are, and make artifacts of beauty, or become the outposts of beauty that we have been created to be, and live into our purpose and our true identity. And so what I have seen is if there is any industry or any misunderstanding in our culture, I would say how beauty has been warped to create shame. Shame is not out for my good. It is actually out to literally destroy me. And I saw for me how I was viewing beauty, my body, my relationship with food and exercise. It was really destroying me. And I saw how it was destroying other people, sometimes literally, in terms of maybe an eating disorder was literally taking their life, and then sometimes perhaps more in other ways, mental, emotional, energy, etc. And so I think when we can kind of take a step back and see, you think that we oftentimes know how good something is by its fruit. And I started to evaluate American or societal beauty, and I saw the fruit of it was anything but actually beautiful. And so, yes, I think framing and seeing the effects of beauty from that shame perspective and as a tool of evil has made all the difference in my own journey.
Well, then you go into that, which is such a beautiful invitation, is that God invites us to go on this mission with him because not only is shame trying to destroy us, it's spiritually keeping us from helping God reclaim the beauty of this fallen world. And that's so powerful.
Mm.
If women can remember, that will help tremendously with when you have doubts or shame or worries, how you look, and talk about internally and say, wait a second, that's not God. That's
What can be helpful with that is paying attention to what am I believing about myself, about my body, about beauty, and almost doing like a mental audit. And is this life giving? Is this shame? And is this shame speaking? Or is this voice or is this belief life giving? And so I love what you said, like noticing that and then being like, actually, this isn't God. And so that we can choose something different and not keep playing into the ploys of shame.
one part in your book is a turning moment for you, which I think will be for many people, is when you had your prayer partner
Mm.
and then you received something you didn't expect.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. It was interesting because I was someone who I've grown up with a deep faith. It's been something that's been always important to me. And so when I had this struggle with noting that something was off in my relationship with food and exercise is how it showed up in my own life, was I felt like guilty about it. And I was like, I don't know how to be integrated in this area, meaning I didn't know how God fit into it at all. And I would say even more so, I know for me, sometimes when messages would come up in the church around those types of struggles, it would be like framed as like an idol, like thinking about your body too much or
Mm.
beauty is like bad, so just don't do it. And so those weren't very helpful messages. And I shouldn't generalize, not all church places in the church, but that was oftentimes what would come up in the places I found myself hearing messages about those things. But what was really significant about this prayer experience is I was led by my prayer partner to envision the face of Jesus. And what really was striking to me is I like saw no judgment. I expected maybe God had some judgment, I think, toward this struggle that I had, but that is not what I experienced. I experienced like eyes of compassion and empathy and this deep sense that God or Jesus was like totally in this with me. And he knew every step of my journey. He knew the struggle. He saw the struggle. And it was just like this deep withness and like oneness that I experienced and it was felt palpable. And I started to see that God was with me and he was for me in this, and he was going to help walk out of it with me. And
And
so that was such a total restructure of how I had like the posture that I had previously held and my own understanding of how God was with me in the experience.
do you think on those lines that is an area that the church can be better at? Because there's so many women struggling against this. We know we're told take our thoughts captive, live in the world, but not be of the world. But is there more to help guide women through this? Because, like you said, we're going to be exposed to it.
Leslie Schilling just wrote a book about this and is specifically how diet culture has infiltrated the church, which I have seen numerous times. And so I think this has gotten so tricky because sometimes the messages that are being, like ways that certain passages are being framed is actually shrouded in diet culture. And of course, this is not, I don't think anyone is meaning ill. I think
Mhm.
that people's intentions are good, but I just think we have become so saturated in diet culture, trying to shrink our bodies and upholding thinness. I think that absolutely it could be very helpful to have a different stance toward these issues in the church. I think largely perhaps having, first of all, maybe a lot of compassion toward this struggle for women
Mhm.
because we have been so inundated with diet culture, advertising, beauty culture. And so I think having that stance of compassion and just seeing how we've been played as a society when it comes to beauty and body image and diet culture, seeing how those things have been at work and seeing how we can separate ourselves from those things, but then also kind of, maybe this is a weird way to say it, but like almost like tend to the effects of it
Mhm.
and the wounding that has happened. Also, I would say, as I talk about in the book, choosing a different kind of beauty to absorb ourselves in after, first of all, I think there's a lot that we can do in the church to help women have compassion toward women in this area, but also help us move away from shame in this ground that I do think that the enemy has a lot of influence.
Well, that is true. It is a balance. I mean, I do think Jesus wants us to take care of ourselves. I work actually as a makeup artist for film and television, and that's why it's been such a struggle for me because I was in it halfway when I gave my life back to Jesus. And I say that only because as a child, I knew Jesus and I walked away at 16 to dysfunctional family and trauma and things. And I associated God with that, although he wasn't. And he understood the whole time. So when I came back to him, and my eyes were certainly open because now I'm in this industry that is promoting this. I mean, when you see a beautiful actress on screen and she shows her body, most of the time it's a body double.
Interesting.
The hands are a hand double. The woman with the best nails and the best hands, I often would say to God, "Why did you slap me there?" So over time, though, now I see why He's placed me there.
Mhm.
And part of it's doing this, part of it's when I'm working with women and they are insecure, even a very beautiful woman sitting in front of that mirror, looking and all their flaws are, and then they have to go in front of that camera. And then that nurturing and gentleness and love that you can give to somebody going through that and then redirecting them to spirituality and faith and how that is the focus and how if we start there and then we can bring that out, we can find a balance there. So what you're talking about really helps me come to terms with my experience, what I do for a living.
That's super interesting. This is a super interesting conversation to have from your perspective. Wow. I'm like thinking of different questions for you now. Yeah.
Well, I had this one lady who was older and she was like, "Oh, you got anything for these under eyes?" And she was gorgeous. I'm like, "You're so beautiful." It's about inside, it's about what you eat and exercise and, drink lots of water. And it's also about whether you're happy. And then she said, "Well, I have my faith." And she was a Christian woman. And then by the end of the conversation, she was no longer focused on her when she was glowing and she was just ready to go be on camera. So those moments, they're not all the time, but those few moments I go, okay, God, I see the plan, I see,
Yeah.
where that is. It has been quite a journey to see it through that filter. And God put you through your journey to see through your filter. and have these discussions, because I think it's really important now. And I see it everywhere, not just with Christian women. I do see it with non-Christian women too, and men too, and teens, and just people questioning, this can't be all there is, like searching for something more inner, inner beauty. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I do see perhaps in certain circles, maybe like a new emerging openness to spirituality in some ways. Like, I've been really interested to see the popularity of the Chosen series. And I've been following a researcher on spirituality and just certain conversations about spirituality being highlighted. Perhaps I wasn't seeing as much previously. I wonder too, like if maybe post COVID, whoa, like the world can fall apart pretty easily. And, the things that once seemed so certain, like the whatever, like going to my office every day. And that all seemed so like that was going to be how the world was. I think that maybe we saw the fragility of life, of our way of life. And so I wonder if that has maybe opened a little bit. There's been a little bit more emergence or openness to spirituality and like, yeah, what else is there if this is all kind of a little bit more fragile than we previously thought.
I want to take the inner beauty to your chapter about eternal beauty, because I think that's so important too, at least in my own journey, is realizing that's what I should be living for. But then when you wrote that we're not just mere mortals,
Oh, yeah.
that took to another level for me.
Yes. This all gets a little mystical and like even beyond, I think, like what we can understand. But I'll say, which I think is actually kind of cool and like mysterious. But so my new definition of authentic beauty through this process, my definition is the life of God at work in us and among us. And so I should say a little bit about this, the theologian where I started to think about this or where I got this idea. His name is Baxter Kruger, and he wrote a book called The Dance. And he talks about how there is this interplay, this dynamic interplay of love that has always been and still is and will always be going on between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So there's this like dynamic energy. The dance is happening like everywhere all the time. And so I started to realize that dance is in me. I was created out of that dance of love, like each of us is. And so I think that is the kind of beauty that is eternal and is worth our life. Whereas cultural, societal beauty is fleeting in terms of how it is defined. And it's very fickle in terms of like, are we accepted by society? Are we not? And I just don't think it has a leg to stand on in terms of eternality and even, culture changes as well. Whereas this eternal beauty, like I and you, we are already a part of it. We always have been. I was just talking with a friend. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Like that's a really big topic. And I think to even consider that we have been made in the image of this unbelievably loving God who created this cosmos that we don't quite understand. We don't even know where it ends. God created us and we are made in that image. Like that is glorious and beautiful and mind boggling. But to even begin to grasp that, I think is not even grasp it, but like begin to think about that. We are like, I think there's much more glory and beauty in us than that is reflected in us and through us than we can even imagine.
Yeah. I think that is so beautiful. And I think that is, you know, for me, it helps to reframe it and say, no, I am a beautiful daughter of God and I'm made in his image and beauty. And then another part to that really helps me, and I want to get your thoughts. I was thinking about flawless, and then in Songs of Solomon, I think it's 4:9, where it says, you're beautiful, there's no flaw in you, right? And then this one writer, Whitney Atkin, wrote in her book, Overlooked, she wrote about how when God looks at us, he sees us as the beauty of Jesus because we've been washed clean by him. We are flawless because of Christ. We're beautiful because we're made in God's image. That is so powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a very different flawless than our culture. Our culture teaches us to work toward a flawlessness that is like a physical or aesthetic flaw. Whereas, yeah, this flawlessness that God sees like I that's crazy that when God sees us, like all he sees is love and not our sin or our flaws. Like that concept is like mind blowing.
And there's so much grace to give us. I think that the younger generation really need these guidelines and help and this kind of conversation. They're going to see these things. You could control their input, which is the television or their social media, but they're going to see it. They're going to see it even reflected in the way people dress at school. How do we have this conversation? And how,
That is a great question, Deborah. And I've been thinking a lot about that. One thing is teaching some of the things that I talk about in the book, like about media literacy, expanding our definition of beauty, maybe raising some awareness around why this kind of beauty that we are being sold is actually broken and not good for us. I think raising awareness around those things can be helpful. I think oftentimes, so one of my taglines for the podcast is let's redefine beauty together. And the
Mm,
reason why I say together is because I can talk all I want on podcasts or write this book. But I really am hoping to influence other people to come alongside me. And, culture changes when it was just like one person at a time. And so if we can start to redefine beauty in our own hearts and in our own homes, my hope is that those shifts will start to make a difference and we can start shifting the current in certain subcultures. I think oftentimes we're so influenced, and I think this is even more true for younger people, just being influenced by our peers. And so the more like safe and true spaces we can have when it comes to beauty and speaking into young people's lives about what makes them beautiful and their purpose and how God sees them, the more I think we can have these types of conversations that you and I have been having. I'm hopeful that can help us start to shift this. But yeah, I think we're up against something big, especially with social media. So I think there's even more reason for us to start shifting the cultures we're a part of so we can start shifting how we think about beauty for the younger generation.
I love that so much. Well, I think we're almost at our time. And so I just want to say thank you so much. This has been so amazing and such a wonderful moment be here with you and share this with you. And I'm so happy for your book. And I know it's going to change so many hearts and minds and the culture. People are, and maybe it is the shift after COVID, but people are looking for something real, something authentic, something true. We do have a God that can help us with this. He's there, the compassion, the grace, the love, and sees what we're all going through. Is there anything else you want to tell us about that we can
Sure.
keep an eye out for?
I would love to invite people to the podcast Impossible Beauty just because I think we have been taught to think about beauty in a certain way for decades, most of us. And so I think it takes a lot of time and shifts to start having a different perspective around beauty, diet, and beauty culture. And so I would invite people to come over to the Impossible Beauty podcast. And what I try to do there is have guests on to help me define what beauty truly is, what it is not, and how we go about finding beauty in a broken world. I would love to have people join me there. And I'm doing some smaller group type things around redefining beauty this fall. And then I'm looking into maybe doing a couple, maybe like retreat type things in the spring. So nothing ready yet to announce, but so the podcast and then the book, Soul Deep Beauty, Fighting for Our True Worth in a World Demanding Flawless would be another great place for people to continue to unpack these ideas.
Right. And then that they sign up for your Instagram and your blog and your podcast, and they can see when these retreats or whatever you have coming up for people.
Yes, Ellen, I should probably say, so on Instagram, I'm at melissa.louise.johnson and then also at impossible.beauty. And then on Facebook, it's Impossible Beauty Blog and Podcast.
And then how did you come up with Impossible Beauty?
Yeah, so a really great question. I think the interesting part, and if this totally makes sense, that people I think oftentimes that impossible beauty means like impossible beauty standards. However, I actually mean that the way I came up with it, I was in my living room and it was in the morning time and I was having a prayer time and the light was pouring in and it just seemed like too good, like a beauty that was so huge. It's like too good to be true. And so it's like, if we see the fullness of who God is, like it seems like this love and this goodness is overwhelming to our senses. It seems too good to be true. It feels like an impossible beauty, but it
Mhm.
actually is real.
I love it. I think it's very beautiful.